And these will be shared via our Brain Center YouTube channel, and they are also going to be posted with additional resources recommended by Dr. Palmer at our event site, which is www.bw.civic. So you can find this session there. Just a reminder that this event is rooted in expectations established by BW's standards of conduct. So we expect this to be a space where we can engage empathetically, respectfully, and thoughtfully together. We had a little bit of a break last week. We didn't have any sessions, but this is officially 1 month into the new Civic Leads series. This is our 5th session, and we have 5 sessions to go within the next 2 weeks. We plan on continuing this series into the fall, so if you have an idea of something you'd like to share, or if there's a topic you'd like to see us exploring together, please don't hesitate to reach out. I know we've had several folks who have done so, and it's led to some great ideas already for the fall. So please continue to share your ideas, and let's keep this going. Within the last month, we have seen the movement for racial justice nationally continue to develop. So I read an article over the weekend that outlined some of the small steps that particularly larger cities have taken related to changes in funding and new policy development for policing. We're going to explore that topic later in this Civic Leads series. Protests have continued in places like Portland with controversies related to federal law enforcement deployments. Over the last 2 weeks, we celebrated the lives and civil rights contributions of great leaders like U.S. Representative John Lewis and Reverend C.T. Vivian. And if we really zoom in a bit and look within our own BW community, BW has begun the work, the serious work, of examining our own challenges and spaces for change related to racial equity, taking a critical look at what the BW experience means, and seeking feedback and launching the new Racial Equity Task Force. So today's session continues our examination of the historic roots of institutional and systemic racism. It provides insight into how the struggle for civil rights continues today. I want to do a brief intro for Dr. Palmer. Her full bio was shared with you in the link for tonight's event. But Dr. Palmer is a professor in the Department of Politics and Global Citizenship, also the executive director of the Center for Women in Politics of Ohio, the CWPO. The CWPO engages students, scholars, media, and the public in sharing over 100 years of Ohio history and the remarkable stories of the women who have run for public office. Professor Palmer teaches courses on civil rights and liberties, elections, women in politics, and serves as the director of the Legal Studies Program and pre-law advisor. There's a long list of the national and international talks she has given and the areas where she has been reached out to as an expert in these areas. In 2018, she was awarded the Erika Fairchild Award by the Southern Political Science Association for her strong record of service and commitment to students and teaching. I know Dr. Palmer's been involved in a lot of our Brain Center programs focused on civic learning, and we are thrilled to have you with us tonight to share about this important topic and what we can do together moving forward. So thank you, Dr. Palmer, and I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. I'm really excited to be talking about this, and I noticed a lot of familiar names in the attendees list, so I guess I'm going to have to make this good. So let's switch. I do have some slides. Let's see if we can get those up. So here we go. So the way we're going to do this is I'm old and easily distracted, so I'm not going to be paying too close attention to the chat box. But if you do have a question that is relevant to what we're talking about, what I'm talking about at that moment, and Steve and Julie will interrupt me, especially if you just have a quick clarification question. Happy to be interrupted. And then I'm going to try to make this kind of interactive too. So you guys are going to have the opportunity to respond to some questions and raise your hand and tell me how things are going. And so my goal is, if you learn one thing tonight that you didn't know before, then I consider this a smashing success. So basically, I titled tonight's talk, The U.S. Constitution and America's Original Sin, Civil Rights Then and Now. We're going to talk a lot about voting rights, which is just really depressing, but I didn't want to leave you on a total downer, and so then I wanted to sort of bring it up to the big Supreme Court decision that happened this summer regarding gay rights. Also talk a little bit about how all of these things are intertwined. So just some general themes to keep in mind before we dive in. I think most Americans don't really understand that the U.S. Constitution protects you from the government. That's it. It doesn't protect you from your employer. It doesn't protect you from your big brother. It doesn't protect you from businesses. It only protects you from the government. And the language, I think, is really, really important. So I have the first part of the First Amendment up here. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or the press. And I think it's really important to look at this language. First of all, it's written in the negative. And it says Congress shall make no law. So basically this is putting a limitation on the government. Now, Congress has been expanded to include all levels of government over time. This now goes all the way down to school boards and state legislatures and city councils. But it's basically saying, okay, government, you can't do this. This is a very different way to think about rights than almost every other country on the planet thinks about them. This is very different than saying everybody has freedom of religion. Everybody has the freedom of speech. Those are extraordinarily broad ways of thinking about this and might apply to your employer or whoever. But in the United States, our Constitution is about limiting the government. And we have to keep in mind that, this is language from 200 years ago, and it still shapes our lives today. I like to think of the Constitution as kind of our secular religion. We have this old document, this old text, and nobody really knows what it means. Maybe even the framers had very different ideas about what this language meant, and we're still arguing over it because it's important to us. And you have to keep in mind that that's not true in every country. But here in the United States, we take this document seriously, and as a result, we have huge fights over it. So another major theme that I hope you get out of this is that the legal history of the rights of Blacks in America is intertwined in really complex and sometimes very strange ways with the history of women and the LGBTQ plus community. Our history is not linear. When I was in college, I always assumed that, there was the slow, steady forward march of progress, and we were continually expanding the rights of people. And that's just not true. And so sometimes you'll see an advance for one group at the expense of another, or sometimes something that is used to take away rights for one group is used to take away rights of another group. And so it is this very complex story, but that's also what makes it interesting. So let's talk about the Constitution. In the original Constitution, this is the first 7 articles that were ratified in 1789, the word slavery does not appear, not even in the 3/5 compromise, and I'm going to show you that language in a second. But what's fascinating and really disheartening is that slavery permeates the Constitution. It is built into the DNA of our Constitution, even though that word doesn't appear. And so this is Article 1, Clause 3 of the Constitution. So this was drafted in 1787 and ratified in 1789. And it says, representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, and those bound to a service of term of years. So in other words, indentured servants, and 3/5 of all other persons. Now, I remember learning about this in like 3rd grade and being taught about what that meant. But I'm fascinated by the fact that it's like 3/5 of all other persons. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We know what we mean. And the fact that they didn't use the word slaves, I think, is very interesting. And I wish I knew more about the drafting of this clause. But there it is for you. We all know what this means without them actually stating it clearly. So then this clause goes on to say the actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of the Congress and within every subsequent 10 years in such manner as they shall by law direct. So what this is really establishing is 2 important concepts. First of all, this is what establishes the census. So the census, most people don't know that the census is mandated by the Constitution. And it says that it will be done every 10 years. And of course, so what they meant was the first census happened in 1790. And so this is all about the census, and the whole point of the census is to determine the number of members in the House of Representatives that each state gets. Now, the census has become way more important because it determines all kinds of other really important things as well. And this is incredibly important because I don't know if you paid attention to the headlines today, but the census just announced that they are going to shorten the amount of time that they're going to spend actually doing the count this year. They were going to do everything up until October, the end of October, Halloween, and then they just announced today that, oh, nope, September 30th is when we're going to stop counting. And a lot of people are really worried because this means that we're probably going to have a very serious undercount, but that undercount is not going to be random. This is going to disproportionately affect people of color and poor people and people who are harder to count, that take a lot of time. And as a result, we are going to be off not only in our apportionment to the House of Representatives, but the census determines how much money the federal government allocates in all kinds of ways to provide people with services. So this is extraordinarily political, but it's mandated by the Constitution. So they did a count in 17. So the next part of the Constitution actually lays out what the original apportionment, how the members of the House of Representatives were going to be allocated in the various Congress in 1789. So the next clause in Article 1, Clause 3 basically says, it has a list. It says, okay, based on the numbers that we have, this is how many House members we're going to give to each of the states. And then we know we're going to hit the reset button in 1790 and recount it. And these numbers actually changed a lot. But scholars have gone on and figured out, well, okay, based on the 3/5 calculation, that second column there, this is how many members of the House of Representatives each state got. And as you can see, states from the North got 36 out of the 65 members. And states from this, what eventually would become part of the Confederacy, got 29 with the 3/5 calculation. So in other words, counting 3/5 of enslaved people in these calculations. And scholars have tried to figure out, well, okay, what if we didn't have the 3/5 calculation? What would the original first House of Representatives looked like? And you can see how different it would have been. The states in the North would have had 43 of the 65 members, and the states from the South would have only had 22. So what this is doing is inflating the power of the slave states in the very first House of Representatives, and continues to do this until the Civil War. So this is baked into our very first Congress and the way that members of Congress were allocated from the very beginning. So then and now, let's talk a little bit about voting rights. So I want to go back to the Civil War amendments of the Constitution. We have the 13th Amendment, which was passed in 1865, and I highly recommend two films. Lincoln is a fictionalized account, but it's pretty true. I think it does a pretty good job as far as Hollywood movie goes. It's a story of the passage of the 13th Amendment. And it might not be 100% historically accurate, but it gives you a really good idea of how this amendment came to be. But then also there's another documentary called 13th, which is fascinating. I have to admit I haven't seen it yet, but it's I've heard terrific things about it. Has anybody seen it? If you want to raise your hands, I'm just really curious to see if people have seen this. So a couple people. Cool, yeah, and so I've left out part of the second part of the 13th Amendment. And so the first part says, neither slavery or involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So this is the amendment to the Constitution that formally banned slavery. Now the next part of that amendment, which I've left out, has an exception, which says basically except for convicts. So if you're in jail, you can be forced to do forced labor, and so you can trace that all the way to the present-day prison industrial complex, and the reason why blacks are disproportionately represented in our prison system, and that's what the documentary 13th is all about. So highly recommend both of those films. The 14th Amendment, which was passed during Reconstruction in 1868, says no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. No state shall deny any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now, there's a lot in there that is really, really important. The 14th Amendment is one of the most litigated amendments of the Constitution. And I think this language is really important, where it says no state shall deny any person. So again, written in the negative, saying states can't mess around with this. Employers, businesses, those kinds of things, that's different. We're leaving them out. And it says any person. And that was not by accident. Members of Congress from the North were very worried that states in the South after the Civil War would basically just say, hey, blacks aren't citizens, they're not people, we don't have to guarantee them rights. And so the 14th Amendment is like, no, none of that. We are saying any person. And what's also interesting is, of course, this particular clause says person, not citizen. So if you are in the boundaries of the United States, you have 14th Amendment protections. And of course, this has become controversial over the past couple of years as well, because it does apply to undocumented immigrants. So the 14th Amendment is very vague. It's very broad. It is written in negative, but for the most part, it's pretty broad. No state shall deny any person equal protection of the laws. This is really broad and vague, and we're still trying to figure out exactly what that means. And contrast this to the 15th Amendment passed in 1870. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied on account of race. Okay, so that's really clear. It's basically saying, this is what's going to happen. There's no getting around this, or is there? But it's very clear. It's very specific. But we're going to talk about how states manage to find ways to get around the 15th Amendment. So 1874, the Supreme Court decided the case of Minor v. Happersett. And to the best of my knowledge, this is the earliest voting rights case that the Supreme Court ever dealt with. And what was interesting is Virginia Minor was part of the suffrage movement. She knew Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and she was part of their big drive to actually have women go out and vote in the 1870s and try to get themselves arrested so they could take a case all the way to the Supreme Court. And they interpreted the 14th Amendment as already enfranchising women. So even though the word sex does not appear in the 15th Amendment, a lot of women and a lot of lawyers at the time thought, well, hey, denying women the right to vote is denying women equal protection law. So therefore, why wouldn't the 14th Amendment have enfranchised women? So that's what this case was supposed to be all about. Virginia Minor went out and tried to vote in a federal election. She got denied the ability, she was denied registration, so she got to sue the federal government, and her case went all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, it's fascinating if you read this opinion. It's one of those opinions that after you read it, you kind of shake your head and go, huh? Like, what are they talking about? The Supreme Court, the justices don't mention the Constitution or the 14th Amendment at all. Instead, they quote the Bible a lot and talk about women's proper place. But they also say some really interesting things about states and voting rights. The Supreme Court agreed that women were citizens, but there's a catch. The Constitution does not guarantee the right to vote. Surprise, surprise. And in fact, there's language in the Constitution, according to the Supreme Court at the time, that it's all up to states to determine who can vote. So yeah, women are citizens, they can get passports and all that kind of good stuff, but the Constitution doesn't guarantee the right to vote. It's really totally up to states to determine who is going to be able to be qualified to vote. So if you allow states to determine who can vote, states are going to determine who can vote. So what's really ironic about this particular case, even though the direct issue had to do with the question of whether or not women were enfranchised, because of the way the Supreme Court reasoned this case out, in the wake of this case, almost immediately, states in the South begin to use that language to be able to justify keeping all kinds of people from voting. Now, they know they can't just come out and say, yeah, we're trying to disenfranchise blacks because of the 15th Amendment. So they come up with all kinds of sneaky, fun ways of doing it, which on the surface don't appear to be about race at all. So one of the examples that you might be familiar with is what's called a poll tax. And so the idea was, hey, elections are expensive. So, people, if you want to vote, you're going to have to pay. And so this is an example of a receipt from 1912 in Louisiana, which had a poll tax, and you had to pay $1 to vote, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's $26 in today's, money. That's a lot of money. And so as a result, what you've done here is basically disenfranchised a lot of poor people, which are disproportionately going to be black. The whole point of this was to disenfranchise as many blacks as possible, even though on the surface, we're just going to call it a poll tax. And so wink, wink, nudge, nudge, we're not violating the 15th Amendment. Another really common practice was what were called literacy tests. Now, these took a wide variety of forms, and one of the most notorious ones was in Alabama. And so the way this worked is when you wanted to register to vote, you walked up to the registrar's office, and the registrar had a list of 100 questions. And the registrar got to determine how many questions you were asked and how many you had to get right in order to be qualified to vote. So obviously this is incredibly arbitrary. And so I think we'll do a little literacy test here. And so in the chat box, if you want to try to guess or figure out what the answers, I have 3 questions for you. And so if people want to provide us what they think their answers are going to be, I think that'd be kind of fun. So one of the questions is, if Congress cannot agree on when to adjourn, who sets the time? If Congress cannot agree on when to adjourn, who sets the time? So we've got the vice president, it was one possible answer. The speaker. Any other good guesses? So that's one question. Let me give you another question. If no person receives a majority of electoral college votes, the vice president is chosen by. If no person receives a majority of electoral college votes, the vice president is chosen by. Any guesses here? Need like Jeopardy music or something like that. So Congress. All right, I'll give you one more question. The Constitution, this is my favorite question, and I only know the answer to this because I live there. The Constitution limits the size of the District of Columbia to what size? The Constitution limits the size of the District of Columbia to what size? So you can take like how many square miles? Wow, I really stumped you. No guesses here? Now, all 3 of these things are in the Constitution. And so here are the answers. If Congress cannot agree on when to adjourn, who sets the time? That's actually the president. Now, this hardly ever happens because, of course, Congress knows this and they don't want the president setting their adjournment time, so they're always going to set it. So that very rarely happens, but it's in the Constitution. If no person receives a majority of electoral college votes, the vice president is chosen by the Senate. So the House picks the president, the Senate picks the vice president. And oh, what fun would that be if you had each house controlled by a different party? The Constitution limits the size of the District of Columbia to 10 square miles. So if you've ever looked at a map of DC, you'll notice that it's almost a perfect diamond. So it's 10 by 10, so it's 100 square miles. But the part that's south of the Potomac was ceded back to Virginia in 1840 something. So it's currently 63 square miles, but it can actually be as large as 100. So, just think about this. I'm kind of guessing that there probably weren't too many people who got all 3 of those right. So you can imagine what a powerful tool this was to keep specific people based on the color of their skin from voting. The registrar would just fire all these questions, these ridiculously hard questions at you until you got one wrong. It's like, oh, sorry, you can't vote because you're not politically literate and you don't know enough about the Constitution. I would venture to guess that the vast majority of Americans today would not pass this test. So since the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870 until 1905, almost 100 years, states in the South did everything they could to deny blacks the right to vote. So now I kind of want to speed ahead and talk about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This legislation has been called the most successful legislation in the history of Congress because it did exactly what it set out to do, and it did it very, very well. Now, I do want to get in the weeds a little bit here because this is important because there's been a very important Supreme Court case regarding the Voting Rights Act, which has basically changed everything. And I want you to understand what happened. So Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is pretty clear. It prohibits voting practices or procedures that discriminate on the basis of race. So it's a reaffirmation of the 15th Amendment. Now, Section 4 and 5 go together. Section 4 is a formula for determining what are called covered jurisdictions. So in other words, we're going to look at a map and we're going to look at states and counties and to determine whether or not there's been discrimination and voter suppression of blacks in the past. And so they had a formula that determined that if you had black turnout lower than 50%, you were going to be a county or a state that was quote unquote a covered jurisdiction. Now, Section 5 was all about enforcement. So all covered jurisdictions, all states and counties that had passed discrimination in their history had to submit any change in their voting procedure to the Department of Justice or a three-judge federal judge panel in DC for what's called pre-clearance. So let's say a county in Georgia wanted to change the way the ballot looked. They would have to actually go before a three-judge panel or the Department of Justice to get that approved. Let's say they wanted to change the hours that people could vote. They would have to go to the Department of Justice or a three-judge panel. Any change in voting procedures had to get approved by the federal government, and it worked. What we saw in the wake of the Voting Rights Act was a very dramatic increase in the proportion of blacks that were registered to vote and voted. And basically, in the 2000s, we saw blacks and whites turning out in these areas at about the same rates as whites. So what happens next is, oh, wait, I wanted to show you a map so you have some idea of what this looked like. So the dark purple were covered jurisdictions since 1965, and then the light purple were added. So every once in a while, Congress would go back and sort of figure out and update the map. And then the beige is the ones that were originally covered but expired. And you can see it's a mishmash of counties and states, mostly in the South. So along comes a Supreme Court case in 2013, Shelby County versus Holder. And so white voters in Shelby County, Georgia, which was a covered jurisdiction, filed suit, basically arguing that Sections 4 and 5 of the VRA, the Voting Rights Act, were unconstitutional. And by a vote of 5-4, the Supreme Court said Section 4 is unconstitutional. It's old. Congress hasn't updated it. It's in the past. There's no more racism. There's no more discrimination. All we have to do is look at the evidence and see that blacks and whites are voting at the same rates. Therefore, we're done. Woohoo! They didn't say anything about Section 5, but they did say Section 4 is unconstitutional because it was outdated. So here's the thing. If you get rid of Section 4, what does that mean? Basically, the formula for determining who's covered is gone. So the ramification of that, without the Supreme Court having to say it, it means Section 5 is basically dead as well. And we know from history that if you allow states to make changes to their election procedures, states are going to make changes to their election procedures. The day after Shelby is decided, states in the South start requiring new registration and voter ID requirements justified by preventing voter fraud, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, in order to disenfranchise blacks. So I can give you an example in North Carolina. So like I said, this is one of the examples where the state legislature, which was controlled by Republicans at the time, the day after Shelby comes down, they start passing all kinds of legislation to start making it harder to vote. So in 2012, blacks and whites had equal rates of turnout in North Carolina, and North Carolina was becoming a swing state. Remember, in 2008, Barack Obama won North Carolina, and the Republicans in the state are not happy with this. And so as a result, they start passing all kinds of measures to try to make it harder to vote. They had strict photo ID requirements. They shortened early voting. In fact, what they did is they got data to figure out which weekend had the highest turnout among black voters, and they got rid of that weekend for early voting. They eliminated same-day voter registration. And these were all things, and we know they didn't even really try to hide what they were doing. We know from emails and conversations between Republican legislators that they were specifically targeting black votes. And so what's fascinating, this case only went to the U.S. Court of Appeals, and they shut down these laws in North Carolina. And in fact, based on the data that they had, which wasn't that hard for them to get, these new laws targeted African Americans with surgical precision. That is a line right out of the judge's opinions. So in this particular case, the Court of Appeals struck down these laws. However, a lot of other states have passed different kinds of restrictions on voting, and the Supreme Court has upheld a lot of these. They've upheld measures in Texas and Wisconsin, and even in Ohio, we have the voter purge law that's been upheld by the Supreme Court. So in the wake of the Shelby decision, more and more states are trying to make it harder and harder to vote, and the Supreme Court is upholding a lot of these laws. And hey, college students who are listening to this, they're coming after you. Some states are making it a lot harder for college students to vote. They are eliminating polling places on campuses. They're imposing strict residency requirements. They're requiring driver's license and car registration, which means that you may have to pay. If you want to vote in the state where you're going to college, you might have to pay anywhere from between $100 and $300, depending on which state you're in, just to be able to vote. So, don't think that this is just about race. It's about young people as well. They are coming after you. So here's what I want to leave you with this. Preventing voter fraud is code for disenfranchising blacks and young people. Study after study after study shows that there is no such thing as voter fraud in this country. Millions of votes have been analyzed over 2 decades, and they've found like 3 incidents of actual voter fraud. Anytime you hear anybody proposing a law that makes it harder to vote, you need to question the reason. You should be asking, who's proposing this? What are the political ramifications? Who is this going to affect? Because anytime you hear that phrase, voter fraud, it's code, because what they're really doing is what's been going on for over 100 years in this country, and that is finding ways to disenfranchise people without saying that that's what they're doing. Now, because I know this is all really depressing and it just really pisses me off if you can't tell, I did want to leave us on a slightly happier note and talk a little bit about civil rights. But I'm going to go back in the past again and just quickly mention this sort of infamous case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. I'm assuming that most of you have heard of this case. This is where the Supreme Court basically declared that separate but equal is constitutional under the 14th Amendment. Remember, the 14th Amendment says that no state shall deny equal protection. But hey, as long as facilities are equal, separate's cool. So again, the Constitution protects you from the government, not your employer. So that's why I bring this up again. And so they're basically reinterpreting the 14th Amendment here. Yeah, separate but equal is cool. I'm assuming most of you at least heard of this case, but I bring it up because it's relevant today. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is the most powerful legislation that we have that has to do with discrimination in the workplace. So in other words, we do have laws in place now that apply to employers. And again, I think the language here is really relevant and important. So Title VII makes it unlawful for an employer to discriminate because of such individuals' race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. So there's 5 categories of non-discrimination. Now, what's fascinating about this particular law is it had been proposed beginning in the 1930s, but it really didn't get any serious traction until the late 50s. And the category of sex was added at the last minute. The day before the full House vote took place on this bill, The category of sex was added at the last minute, and there's some sort of urban legends about why and how that happened. But the bottom line is, initially, this was all about banning race in the workplace, but then at the last minute, they added the category of sex. So again, another sort of interesting way that the rights of other groups, the rights of various groups are intertwined. So there were two cases in the wake of this law that I want to bring to your attention, and that's Price Waterhouse versus Hopkins, which says you can't treat someone different or fire them because they do not act like a woman or a man. So in other words, sex discrimination includes gender discrimination. So when you look at the actual language of Title VII, it says you cannot discriminate based on sex. Well, what does that include? Most people assume that includes, well, we're not going to hire you because you're a man, or I'm going to not promote you because you're a woman. Like, that's the obvious stuff, right? But what if it doesn't act like the way we expect them in terms of our sex role stereotypes? Does that count as well? And the Supreme Court said, yeah. So this case involved a woman who worked for Price Waterhouse, the biggest accounting firm in the United States, and she was very aggressive. And they called her, and so she was applying for partnership, and they called her, they said she was a bitch, and oh my God, she swore. And so she wasn't fulfilling these gender role stereotypes, and that's why she didn't get partner. She sued, and she won. And then a decade later, we have Oncale versus Sundowner. And so this is a case where a man was being harassed by other men in his workplace. And so would he be covered? And the Supreme Court said yes. And I bring these up because basically since 1998, courts have been really grappling with this issue. Well, okay, if we take all this language together, the language in the statute, Price Waterhouse and Oncale, does Title VII apply to gays and lesbians? Does it apply to transgender people? And federal courts were just all over the place when it came to trying to figure that out, because for some it was clear that it did, and for some it was clear that it didn't. So that leads us to, in my opinion, some good news that we're going to end on, and that's Bostock versus Clayton County. So this was a decision by the Supreme Court that came down on June 15th, and the vote was 6-3. And I never would have guessed that in a million years. All my friends and I had bets that it was going to be 5 to the other direction. And the most important line from this case is an employer who intentionally penalizes an employee for being homosexual or transgender violates Title VII. So this is a very broad interpretation of Title VII, because again, they're getting that simply out of the word sex, right? No, an employer cannot discriminate on the basis of sex, and the Supreme Court decided that that applies to your sexuality and whether or not you're transgender. And I have pictures there of the two plaintiffs in the case, and their stories are actually really just sort of tragic. You know, Gerald Bostock had worked for his employer for years, I think over 10 years, and I don't think he was out to his employer, but through total chance, his employer found out that he had joined a gay softball team, and the next day he got fired. Amy Stevens, her employer knew she was transgender, but tragically she died a month before the Supreme Court handed down its decision. So again, I think, you know, you're seeing the intertwining of, a statute that was originally intended to ban race discrimination. At the last minute, they added sex, and now it's been interpreted to apply to gays, lesbians, and the transgender community. So, I've talked about a lot. I've covered 200 years of history in 40 minutes, which is kind of appalling. And again, I think if you've learned one thing that you didn't know before, I think this, I hope you consider this worth your time. And I'm going to do a shameless plug. I teach a class on constitutional law in the spring of 2021, and I'll be teaching civil rights and liberties, where we're going to talk about a lot of this stuff in much more detail in the spring of 2022. And then I'm teaching women, politics, and law in the fall of 2022. So if there are any students out there who want to explore any of these issues in much more depth, those are some options for you. So thank you for putting up with me and listening to me ramble on and rant for the last 40 minutes. So now I'd love to open it up for any questions that people have.
200 years of history in 40 minutes. That was really good work, Barb.
Yeah.
I'm impressed. Do we have any questions? I can check the chat box here. And I know Julie will share a bit. You've certainly hit home the importance of voting and the role that college students can have in that. And so a lot of efforts that everyone will see on campus this fall related to voter engagement, getting students registered, getting them informed on how they vote, where they vote, all that information. So
Yeah, no, I'm really excited to know that there are all those initiatives on campus because I just think they're so important with the efforts by a lot of state legislatures, all across the country to try to disenfranchise college students.
Any questions? And I can unmute folks if anybody wants to ask that way. You can raise your hand.
I actually have a question. This is Julie. So Barb, what do you recommend in terms of activism to combat these efforts to suppress voters, particularly college students?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of organizations that are organizing college students. There are organizations like the League of Women Voters who are taking this on, but just contacting your state legislators and letting them know that like this is not acceptable. It's still really important to, I think, contact your state representatives and to, if nothing else, you're putting them on notice that you're paying attention and you're watching what they're doing. And so I think those are all things that are really important. It's not that hard. There's just so many great things, happening right now. VH1, I'm old. So I don't know if the students know what VH1 is, but I watch it because RuPaul's Drag Race is on VH1. And, they have a huge voter initiative. And so there's just all kinds of different ways. And it's very simple for people to get involved in an organization if they want to go that route. But like I said, I think just putting your state legislators on notice that you're paying attention is probably one of the most powerful things you can do.
Thanks, Barb. I see a question. I think this is from Zen. Implications of all this related to the current climate of mail-in voting?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are some states that have been doing mail-in voting for 2 decades. Oregon and Washington, for example, have been doing this forever. So it can be done, and it can be done correctly. Yeah, I mean, and as Annika points out, this is all kind of being linked to the sort of sorry state of our postal service, and people being really worried about the capacity of the postal to be able to handle this. And so, as far as Trump postponing the election, I mean, that's impossible. It can't happen. It just can't. The Constitution will stop him. I think there's bipartisan support for that's not going to happen. But I think states are really scrambling right now to make sure that voting does happen, and there are going to be problems. We just know that, and mostly, and part of it is COVID, but part of it is political. So I'll be honest with you, I don't really know. I know mail-in voting can be done well and be done securely. But on the other hand, given the impact on state budgets of COVID, it's possible that this could be a huge cluster. I really have no idea.
Good questions. Other questions out there?
Wow, I don't know whether to feel honored that in my 40-minute rant I didn't piss anybody off, or I was that boring that people were sort of nodding off. That's the problem of doing these electronically. I hope at least a couple people have a really clean bathroom now afterwards.
I learned a lot, Barb, absolutely. And I think your recommendation of 13th is great. For those of you that have been familiar, we have a student organization that's forming on campus related to racial justice. And they will be doing a 13th documentary screening. It'll be like a Netflix party during the fall semester, early on in the fall semester. So I will be sure that information gets sent out to the Civic Leads list. But yeah, that was a great recommendation. It is a powerful documentary for sure. So definitely.
Yeah, and I think I gave you a couple of other films that I think are really great too. And even a movie an older movie there's Mississippi Burning, which I think is a fascinating movie for all kinds of reasons. On the one hand, I think it's a pretty accurate tale of the lynching of the students who went down to Mississippi to register blacks to vote. But ironically enough, it's told from the vantage point of a white FBI agent. So there's layer upon layer there of some interesting discussion to have. But something like that. I mean, but also I would love to recommend the documentary Unbought and Unbossed, which is a documentary about Shirley Chisholm, who was the first African American to serve in Congress. She was elected in 1968, and then in 1972 she ran for president. And so the documentary is about her presidential campaign, and it's fantastic. It's absolutely fascinating. So Shirley Chisholm is a name that you should know and do some research on. Super inspirational and great documentary.
Ellen in the chat has recommended the new John Lewis.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that. Thank you, Ellen.
That one out, that's great.
I mean, I guess the thing that, again, not to leave you too depressed, is like the more things change, the more they stay the same. I mean, that's what I've learned about studying the history of voting rights, is I want to believe that we've come so far, but, then stuff happens.
Barb, here's another question regarding sex-based discrimination and quote-unquote acting like a woman or man. What does this include or not include? It seems very broad.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so I can talk a little bit about the case again. And so, but that is the million-dollar question that was partially answered in the Bostock case. And so for the most part, for a long time, it was a pretty simple way of thinking about it. So the woman in Waterhouse, for example, Ann Hopkins, like I said, she was very masculine in her behavior. She was very aggressive. She didn't wear makeup. In fact, one of her evaluators for partnership said that she should wear more makeup and go to charm school. Meanwhile, her male colleagues were all being, rewarded for that kind of behavior. And so that's pretty much how most judges, I think, understood that. And then for men who acted effeminately, if a man wasn't behaving like a proper man, that would be included as well. And so for most judges who have, I would argue, a pretty simplistic understanding of these issues, that's what it meant. Where it got tricky was in situations where, this is a horrible analogy, and so I apologize ahead of time, but if you're familiar with the show Will and Grace, right, you have the two male gay characters. You have Will, who, when he goes to work, you might never know that he was gay, right? So he's in the suit. He pretty much, for the most part, conforms to gender norms at work in terms of how men are supposed to behave. And then compare him to the character of Jack, who's very flamboyant, much more effeminate, and really challenges traditional gender stereotypes. So if you have a situation like that, the character of Jack might be, if he was fired for being gay, he might have a case under Price Waterhouse, right? Because he is not conforming to gender norms. And one of the gender norms that people have is that men sleep with women and women sleep with men. And because he is not conforming to male gender norms, he might have a case and he might win in front of a particular judge. Jack has a problem, or Will has a problem, though, because he does present as a much more traditional, stereotypical man. So if he's fired for being gay, if he went before a different judge, the judge might be, well, yeah, he was fired because he was gay, not because he was a man. And so these were the kinds of things that were happening in federal courts across the country, where you had all of these conflicting interpretations of what gender discrimination meant. Now, the other thing I'll throw in there is if you were a black woman, that made judges' heads explode. We have all kinds of examples of black women who literally had to choose between whether or not they would file a race discrimination case or a sex discrimination case, because judges couldn't really deal with the fact that, oh my gosh, they're both. And so there's a really famous sex discrimination in which that was the case. I mean, it's a landmark Supreme Court decision. It's Meritor Savings Bank versus Vinson. And it's considered a real advancement in the area of women's rights and sex discrimination. But nobody knew that Michelle Vinson was black. That part of her story is completely erased. And so one of the problems with the law a lot of the time is that if your story doesn't fit into a nice, neat little box, a lot of times you're going to lose, your case is going to be dismissed. So there was a lot of confusion over what gender discrimination meant. And one of the biggest areas of confusion was whether or not that included sexuality and transgender. And so Bostock hopefully has helped us figure that out.
Thanks, Barb. Here's a question from Maddie, who says, do you think that we as a country should regularly be re-examining and revising the Constitution to ensure that it reflects and represents an evolving America?
Oh man, that's the $1,000,000 question. Right now, I'd say no, because I'm really worried about what might happen. But yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. I'm sorry, I'm going to punt and say I don't have an answer for that. I mean, on the one hand, we have the oldest written constitution on the planet, which is really remarkable. And it also suggests that the language is evolving and changing and elastic, and that it can be interpreted to change with the times, but that depends on who's on the Supreme Court. It is really hard to change the Constitution, and sometimes that's a good thing and sometimes it's a bad thing. And so I don't know, I'm sort of curious, Maddie, what do you think? Do you want to just chat or type something in the chat box really quick? Like, I'm curious, what do you think? Because yeah, I don't know. I think there's a lot of problems with the Constitution, but yeah, when it comes to changing it, I get nervous.
And Maddie, I can open your mic if you want to just talk, if it's easier to share that way.
Than typing something. I'm sorry.
No, great. Either way. No, either way. And in the meantime, let's see if Maddie unmutes. I'm not sure.
So Sam's question about Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act was deemed unconstitutional as a tactic to further disenfranchise people. You know, I've read the majority opinion in that case several times, and I believe that, I think Justice Roberts wrote the majority opinion, but don't quote me on that. And whoever did write the majority and the 4 other justices that joined it, I think they really believed that, hey, you know, the Voting Rights Act has done its job. You know, the formula is old. And I mean, they do say in the opinion that, hey, if Congress wants to go and update the formula, we're cool with that. But the problem is they haven't, and they're probably not going to for the foreseeable future. And so I really do think they believe that, hey, look, you know, voter turnout between blacks and whites is the same. You know, this is what the law intended, and so we don't need this anymore. I really think they believed that. I don't think they were being disingenuous. But of course, the minority, the dissent, points out, what are you, nuts? Like, come on. The reason why we have equal turnout is because of this law. And the minute you take that law away, we're going to slide back. And so I don't think the majority was being disingenuous. I really think they believe what they wrote. So Maddie says, I'm honestly not sure. I think the extremism might cause a lot of turmoil, but at the same time, a lot of people do feel like they aren't properly represented. I think there's a case for either side. Yeah. No, I would agree with you, Maddie, completely.
All right, last chance, folks. Oh, there we go. Tom has a comment.
So yeah, Tom, I'm glad that you're piping in on this, because I know you know a lot about this too. And yeah, the politics of updating that formula, is pretty nasty. And combined with that, we haven't talked at all about racial gerrymandering and, the parts of the Voting Rights Act that deal with racial gerrymandering, and the mandates that the Department of Justice handed down in the 90s about what states were supposed to do that the Supreme Court has been slowly chipping away. So, all of these things are intertwined. Yeah, so it's complicated. The law is really quite complicated when you look at how it's, being, the actual language. It's not easy to figure out, but the impact is very clear. Let's see, recommendations for historically based outside reading. Oh my. There's a terrific book called The Law is Good, which is all about the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And it's very short. I think it's only like 150 pages, but I think it's a great read. And so I learned pretty much everything I know about the Voting Rights Act is from that book, and it's very short. And it's called The Law is Good. I'm trying to think of other books that I've read that would be relevant. There's a lot. So think about it, and I'll try to give some recommendations to Christy that she can post online. Or if anybody else who's been listening has anything to recommend, that would be awesome. So I think we're pretty close to an hour.
Julie, do you have your mic? Is it working?
And my cat has started to scream because it's almost his dinner time. So sorry about that. I can hear him.
My mic is working, but my sharing screen option is not, I don't think. So Christy, if you could share the screen. Well, thank you, Barb, for an enlightening presentation. I know I learned a lot, much more than just one thing. And my son is coming in the room now. Abe, just a minute, please. Just wanted to say thanks for everyone who attended. Please join us for our future presentations. The next one is tomorrow at 7 p.m., Racism as a Public Health Crisis. And again, if you have any suggestions for future Civic Lead series presentations, please send those our way. And I do apologize that my son and dog just entered. Everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much, Barb.
Thank you.